sporting event.
Good morning, everyone. You're in for a treat. We have about half a century of White House history represented here. One of the things that defines the White House Social Secretary, first of all, it's a job that I think is redefined in some ways with every occupant and with every First Lady. But one thing that persists is that a Social Secretary has a unique relationship and perspective on their First Ladies. I recently had the opportunity, thanks to the goodness of the White House Historical Association, to do an oral history project interviewing all 14 surviving White House Social Secretaries. And I'll never forget talking to Lucy Winchester, who held the job for Pat Nixon. And who would have known that Pat Nixon had a delicious sense of humor? The first couple months of the Nixon presidency, the president and his staff had just come back from Europe, their first overseas trip. And apparently there were what Lucy characterized as a couple evil individuals in the West Wing who thought it was the height of sophistication to return from Paris with a large blow-up doll. Female doll, for purposes we'll leave to their imagination. In any event, word got back to the First Lady, who for some reason thought it would be appropriate to requisition the doll. She and Lucy sent it to the White House carpentry shop to be blown up. Turned out the Daughters of the American Revolution were coming to the White House the next day. And President Nixon, not knowing what was going on, had run into the Secretary General of the DAR and said, oh, listen, well, why don't you come early and you come upstairs to the second floor? We'll show you around the private quarters. So cut to the picture of Mrs. Nixon and her social secretary getting off the elevator on the second floor, walking down the hall, striding with the blow-up doll between them, trying to find the best place to put it. They finally decided that the Queen's room would be ideal, and it was stashed in the bathtub. And they left. And that's the end of the story. We don't know what happened, but needless to say, that's the kind of history you don't read in the textbooks. And every one of these women, I'm not sure they have stories about blow-up dolls, but they certainly do have uniquely personal history. Bess Abel, can you tell us something about Lady Bird Johnson as surprising or unknown as Pat Nixon's sense of humor?
Well, I don't want to. I want to answer a different question. because you heard them talk about how Mrs. Johnson came into the White House. Well, it wasn't like when anybody else came into the White House. I mean, the president had been shot in the Johnsons' home state. And Mrs. Johnson said, the world looks at the living and wishes for the dead. So it was an awful time for them to come into the White House. And it was some weeks before they did move into the White House. And Mrs. Johnson was continually asked, and her press secretary, Liz Carpenter, was just asked repeatedly, when are the Johnsons moving into the White House? And finally, Mrs. Johnson had just had that up to here. And she said, heaven would that I could help Mrs. Kennedy's comfort, but at least I can help her convenience. So after that, the question stopped. But Mrs. Johnson was just an adventurous. I mean, when you came in to see her, she always wanted to know what you were doing, what was new with you, what was the latest. And when she traveled, she always had these little spiral notebooks about like this, and she kept them in her purse with a ballpoint pen. And she would keep notes about where she was going and what she was seeing. And she took shorthand. And so, fortunately, I read shorthand. Not as neatly as she did, so I could read some of these notes that she had. But we had flown, when LBJ was vice president, we had flown from the U.S. to the Mediterranean, had flown the length of the Mediterranean, had landed in Beirut, and had just walked into the hotel room, which was supposed to be a rest stop before they went to Iran and Turkey and Italy and Lebanon, of course. And Mrs. Johnson's on the phone as I come into the room. She said, "Can you get a car and let's go to Baalbek?" I thought, "What's Baalbek?" I said, "It's supposed to be a rest stop." She said, "I may never get here again." And of course, wouldn't have. And so it was very short order, and we were in a car going up over the Lebanon mountains, past big stacks, men with big stacks of this wonderful flatbread on their head, going through the olive groves and the orchards into Baalbek, where you just saw civilization upon civilization upon civilization. And so I'm so grateful to her for bringing me along for the great adventure, but also for taking me to Baalbek.
Now, you brought up the circumstances surrounding the beginning of the Johnson presidency. I'll give you an opportunity to respond. Recently, I came across an oral history with a member of the Marine Band, was a violinist, Russian violinist, great artist, who complained that at the first tee of the Johnson presidency, and actually I think he said it was upstairs. Anyway, they were performing, and you came up and said, "What the hell are you playing?" And
never would have said such a
well,
never.
and the
Pounce upon you, Richard.
And I'm giving you the opportunity. The violinist said Mozart, and you allegedly said, "Well, knock it off."
We want show tune.
And they were told, "No, the Yellow Rose of Texas."
Oh, no. I don't know whether Mrs. Bush, you were given yellow roses from country to country and state to state. But I think Mrs. Johnson would, every time she went someplace and somebody would play the Yellow Rose of Texas and give her a big bouquet of yellow roses, they thought they were so clever to have thought of it. And she was very, very polite, but she said, "If there's ever an opportunity for people to give me a bouquet of wildflowers, that would be really nice, or to play something else, even the Eyes of Texas."
It's like the story of Harry Truman at the beginning of the Nixon presidency. Nixon wanted to let bygones be bygones, so he donated the White House piano to the Truman Library. And he went out to Independence to make this presentation at the Truman Library. He sat down, grandly began to play the Missouri Waltz. It turns out Harry Truman hated the Missouri Waltz, had always hated the Missouri Waltz. And Mrs. Truman said the only good thing was by then he was so deaf he couldn't hear what the president was playing. Lori Firestone, you were there for the entire first Bush presidency. Those were eventful years, significant years in the history of the White House and the country. Tell us something about Barbara Bush that maybe we don't know.
Well, I think Barbara, everybody knows her because I think she was so open. And, yes, there may be a cute little story or something that hasn't been written, but I think she had a very unique ability to really be a very warm and friendly, and she was everybody's friend. And so I remember back in the days at the vice presidents, And, you know, television was becoming more and more important. And of course, the first ladies aren't on it, but often Vice President Bush would be on it. But people would come to the house, and I would always greet them and say goodbye to them. And they were like, I just had no idea. They were so warm, and they were so friendly and so humorous, and oh, we love them. I just didn't know this about them at all. And I think sometimes that isn't always shown on television, or, you know, you can read it, but you can't. But there's nothing like actually being there. But back to Barbara, I think she was all of that, and she was always interested in everybody. And
how did she communicate her priorities through your work? Because again, my sense is that this is a job that is redefined in some ways, not only by each person who holds it, but above all by each first lady.
Well, I always think that I was very lucky being 8 years at the vice president. So I certainly knew what she liked. And so even there, she was never a micromanager. I mean, she trusted her staff, and she believed in them. She said we knew what she wanted. She was consulted all the time. But then she wasn't there every second. Did you do it? You know, are you sure it's okay? I mean, she believed in us, and we did it.
We know that the first President Bush was no fan of broccoli. You averted an international incident involving the president of Mexico. Could you describe the diplomatic function of the social secretary?
I think this story, not only have I told it, but I think it's actually in Mrs. Bush's book as well. But the President Salinas came for a state dinner, and many of you may remember that he was a Harvard graduate. It was a period of time when they were trying to show that Mexico was getting very sophisticated and more well-developed. And so that evening, Roland, thank you. Roland, I've said his name. Anyway, Roland was the pastry chef, and he always did a beautiful job. And on the menu, he had said he was going to do a Mexican fantasy. And because we were entertaining so often, we didn't have them do samples of every dessert that he was going to do, and we knew it was going to be beautiful. So that evening, the desserts come up from the pastry kitchen into the pantry. And at that time, they weren't individually plated. They were on a tray. And so I went out to the pantry to look at the desserts, as I always did. And Kathy was there with me. And, oh, well, it was horrible. It was this disaster. What he had done was he had created a little adobe house out of marzipan. And inside that house was going to be fresh fruit and sorbets. That part was good. And around the adobe house was a little picket fence with flowers and everything. Well, just the adobe house was bad. But then what he had done, which was the key, he had put a little sleeping Mexican worker taking his siesta with a big sombrero. And so I looked at it. We can't put this in and send this in. And he said, and so Roland, being a Frenchman, no, that's it. This is my dessert. And he stomped out. And I'm looking at Kathy, and, there's a lot of agony going on there for a few minutes. And, of course, we had to make a decision rather quickly. So we found a bouquet of flowers, and as each tray went into the kitchen, we plucked off the little sleeping worker with his sombrero and tucked in a flower and sent it into the dining room, which was not perfect. But I thought, this is so great. A wonderful story about Barbara Bush, too, because usually when the desserts came to the table, she would make a big fanfare of saying how beautiful Roland's dessert was and look at it and wanted everybody to see it. And this time I saw her and the platter came to her first. She looked at it. She got it right away. And she picked up the spoon and hacked the adobe house that split open. And hopefully the president never saw it. But it was, we agreed after that we were not going to do any, foods, whether it was a main course or a dessert, that we're trying to be for the culture of the other country. It was going to be strictly American, so.
Kathy, you're in a unique position, having worked very closely with 3 First Ladies. I won't put you in the awkward position of talking about your most recent employer. Tell us something about Mrs. Reagan, who, as we all know, had a kind of rough time at the start of it with the press in terms of the image that they conjured up. How did she deal with that?
Well, I think,
and how did you deal with that?
Well, I was at first. I guess I was blessed. I was number 2 during those days. I was the deputy to 2 of her social secretaries, Linda Faulkner and Gail Hodges-Burt, and so I think certainly I was aware of it, but I was really in a support position to the 2 social secretaries. But I think that as time went on, first of all, within 2 months, Mrs. Reagan faced a horrible tragedy. Her husband was shot, which was terrible. And I think that you go into a different mentality at that point. I mean, the White House, you have to deal with this potential tragedy. Fortunately, he came out of it. He was recovered beautifully. But I think it changes everything in a very drastic way. And I think that Mrs. Reagan, being Mrs. Reagan, she just had to know that things were always right. And I felt that that's how I eventually was able to anticipate how best to serve her through my 2 bosses, was that, she really did have a checklist. She really did pay attention to the details. And she really was there concerned about her husband, primarily for his health. And so I felt my role was to be as reassuring and to be as on top of those details as possible. And I think that that's even the few times where maybe my boss was traveling and I had to be in charge, I just always had that mindset that, I had to have that checklist. I had to reassure her so she wasn't too nervous, so she wasn't too concerned. And then I always felt it was okay. And I think, the press, it's a feeding frenzy, and they wanted to know how she was coping. And I think that, people who she was closest to, Michael Deaver, Jim Baker, I think they, did their best to reassure her as well every day.
Now, all of you, of course, have had to deal with the unexpected, with tragedy invading the White House. Kathy, you were there on 9/11. What do you remember of that day?
Well, I'm always big on a setting, and we had an incredible several weeks. First of all, most people remember, I guess the few blessings of that horrific day was we had beautiful weather, and ultimately, both in New York and Washington, that helped the relief workers and the emergency workers. At least it wasn't horrible weather. But we had a string of events. We had our first state dinner, President and Mrs. Bush, for the President of Mexico, was September 5th, Vicente Fox. And again, we had beautiful weather. The dinner went flawlessly. I think the Bushes were happy. It was a beautiful occasion. And then on 9/11, we had our next big event for the administration insofar as entertaining, and we had scheduled the annual congressional barbecue. And very often it could be in June or September, and we had picked September with the new administration. I think that gave us more time. And that's a big deal, as Bess will say, going back to LBJ and before, to have the U.S. Congress to the White House in a casual setting, very often with their families. We would have entertainment, a form of barbecue. The Bushes had wanted Tom Perini, who was their good friend who had entertained for them in Texas, and he was there. And a lot of logistics, a lot of elaborate setup. We had over 150 picnic tables on the South Lawn. We had all of Tom's chuck wagon. All of the cooking had been going on. The White House chefs had been cooking and supporting Tom for days. And I came in, I woke up that morning, I thought, oh, how can we be blessed again? We have this magnificent weather and we have a barbecue. So I get into work, and ironically, I had this letter from a man in New York, and I knew I had to call him. They were inviting the Bushes, I think, to a movie screening, and I thought, I've got to call him. It's been over 3 weeks. And I didn't just want to send a letter. And so I dialed this man in Manhattan, and we were on the phone and we were speaking. And I always had my little TV muted, usually on Fox or CNN. And we were on the phone, and I'm not sure who said it first. Maybe I said it first, because I think I glanced at the screen, and I guess it was maybe 8:25 or so. And I said, was there an accident? And he said, well, I don't know. I said, did a plane hit a building in New York? Because I had seen these various shots. And he said, I think I have a message from someone on my phone. So I said, all right, well, we ended our conversation. It was good to speak to you. And just as I hung up was when I think my husband called me, and my brother-in-law is a pilot. And he said, Kathy, have you heard? And unbeknownst to me, I guess enough was going on that one of our administrative assistants had already left the office, but my deputy, Jeannie Figg, was still in her little outer office. And he said, Kathy, a plane has hit, the World Trade Center. And then I think maybe he knew a second plane had hit. So he said, stay in touch. I said, I will. And I hung up the phone. And then I looked up, and there was Russ Appleyard, this darling uniformed Secret Service agent who, they were the ones in the blue blazers who would conduct the tours. And I'd known him for over 20 years. And his face was beet red, and he's a redhead himself. And he said, Kathy, 2 planes have hit the World Trade Center, and a third has hit the Pentagon, and we're evacuating. So I said, okay. And I yelled at Jeannie, and that's when Jeannie and I grabbed our bags, and we ran downstairs. And I think, as my mind went through, as I walked out the door, all of a sudden I saw large weapons coming out. And I thought, well, this is strange. What is this going to do? But all of a sudden I realized we're evacuating. They're going into lockdown, and they wanted us out of sight. So they just opened the large wrought iron gates, and we began walking. I guess there were about 20 of us at that point in the East Wing who were left. And we started walking east. And Jeannie's husband was in an office building up on 14th Street, and he said, why don't you come here? And that's where we ended up. And then I guess the rest is history. Mrs. Bush went into an undisclosed location, and we went on, and the skeleton essential emergency workers at the White House remained, the chief usher and a few others. And I know what they did in the next 48 hours was begin to take all this food and create almost over 700 plates of food to send over to the Pentagon to the relief workers.
Really?
So sing their praises. Yeah, Walter Shive.
You had Vietnam to deal with out on Pennsylvania Avenue with demonstrators, but it didn't stay outside. It occasionally invaded social events. Can you describe what it was like?
First of all, you have to imagine Linda and Lucy's rooms faced Pennsylvania Avenue. And there were demonstrators out there through the evening. They would go into their rooms, go to bed at night, and they were chanters out there. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Hey, hey, and on it would go. I think that the time that it had invaded the White House, I tried to avoid that because I kept track of these full-page ads that ran in the New York Times every Sunday, sometimes during the week, that would have people, artists, writers, signing petitions to the president. And I kept track of those because I didn't want to invite those people to a state dinner. I didn't want them to be sending ugly regrets. We didn't need that. We wanted to pause. But an intellectual had been added to the White House staff, a man from Princeton named Eric Goldman. And Eric had this idea of a White House Festival of the Arts, which we had already been thinking about in my office. But I was talking to Eric about it, and I was going to do X part of it, and he was going to do Y part of it. And the Y part of it was that he was inviting writers to come and read their works. And I was really concerned about that, because I thought that he ought to compare his list of writers to my list of New York Times advertisements. But he didn't. He said that you just want to censor things. And then when I said, now, Eric, we want to have the writers come in the day before and test the mics, be sure the sound levels are right, and that they have the podium at the height that they want, and so forth, and there are no surprises. And he said, oh, you just want people to come in there so you can censor them. I said, Eric, I promise you, they will be glad to have been here and to not just arrive that morning and be presented with lights in their eyes and so forth. So we finally went ahead with that, and they did come, and several of them thanked me and thanked Eric for having them come over and see the room, test things out, and so forth. But then it was he had invited Robert Lowell, and so Lowell, he came, but then he came, or did he write something ahead of time?
He wrote something.
He wrote something ahead of time, but then did he come, actually? Was he there?
I don't think he did.
Okay. So he was invited, and then he, I guess he wrote probably an op-ed piece in the New York Times saying how terrible the Johnsons were and how terrible this whole administration was, and he wasn't going to come to the White House Festival of the Arts. And then somebody came, an acolyte of Robert Lowell, I guess, and was circulating a petition during the party, and I don't think he got any signatures. That was the good thing.
And of course, there was the Eartha Kitt.
Well, she wasn't at
incident.
that party.
No, but she created her own stir.
Yes, and she did. She was very late at arriving to the ladies' lunch. The ladies had gathered. It was one of Mrs. Johnson's women doers' luncheons. There were two things that she did that we never could get a good word for. Women doers' luncheons, but anyway, that's what they were called, and beautification. It just stuck with that. I always wanted a new name. But so Eartha Kitt was late. The ladies had had sherry and orange juice in the blue room, and we were getting ready to take her plate off the table. The luncheon was in the family dining room. So just about that time, all the ladies had gone in, and Eartha Kitt came up the stairs to the main floor, and she came across the foyer, this large marble foyer, and she was doing dancer's leaps all across. It was quite stunning and quite beautiful, but I thought she's going to crash into me in the doorway. So I moved sideways, and she went on into the blue room, and then I said, oh, Miss Kitt, the luncheon has actually started, but I'll take you to your table. So we went in there, and she sat down. The butler who served that table said she never ate a thing, but he kept filling up her wine glass, and she kept emptying it. So I guess she was high as a kite. But the president came in and was making some remarks to the women who were there, saying how terrific it was and women could make anything happen. And this I think the subject of this luncheon was about crime. And as soon as the president left, Eartha Kitt stood up and started talking to Mrs. Johnson about how terrible it was that we were sending these boys halfway around the world to die. And she had just had this baby pulled out of her gut, and she didn't want him going over and dying in Southeast Asia. And Betty Hughes, whose husband was governor of New Jersey, stood up. And the Hugheses had a batch of children, and I think a couple of them were serving in the Pacific. And Mrs. Hughes, I will say it's the one time I remember Mrs. Johnson being taken off guard. But Betty Hughes picked up the ball and ran with it, and about what a wonderful country we are. And we're here to talk about X and make these good things happen for our country. And so forth. Why don't you ask me about some of the good things that happen?
Well,
Rats. Richard, you're the pits. I thought you were my friend.
we'll get to Joan Crawford later. Lori, you, of course, also you had the first Gulf War, which certainly didn't have the same impact.
Or as long.
As Vietnam. But obviously it must have transformed daily life in the White House.
Well, it did. I mean, I think that was the only calm period in terms of events, because up until that time and then afterwards we were, having state dinners once a month and entertaining nonstop. But absolutely, when the war was on, everything came to a stop. And everything shut down, really. I think everybody was as concerned and knew what a grave decision it was that President Bush had made, and felt that emotion that he did. And I know Mrs. Bush certainly did, and conveyed it to all of us and the staff. So it was I really remember it as being a quiet time and having to cancel a couple state dinners. I think one was Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in the Reagan White House, there was no shortage of Hollywood celebrities. I want to ask each of you some of your favorite memories, positive memories. Well, as I said, we're saving Joan Crawford for last. Tell us about running into, I suppose, people who you'd seen on the screen all your life.
Well, it was amazing. I was much younger. I'm dating myself now, but it was 83 when I had, or 84 was when I had first begun my job as the deputy social secretary. And actually they came to me, 24 hours before, and it was before the Chinese state dinner. And it was January. And they said, Kathy, we think we'd like you to succeed Linda Faulkner, who was returning to Texas. And Gail Hodges needed a deputy. And I had been there in the correspondence section and had done a lot of the events. And they thought that I was up to speed. So I said I was honored to do this. And they said, well, you should run home and get a dress. And I thought, what am I going to put on? So I knew exactly. I had a basic black full-length dress, umpire V-neck, long sleeves, and came back. And we had a very lengthy, probably 3 or 4 page, what we called our sequence of events, our scenario for the evening. And I remember looking at it and thinking, how am I going to remember every single one of these moves? But of course, it becomes secondhand. You eventually just go through it, and you recognize you do the same pattern over and over again. And the house, as large as it is, there are just so many limited rooms, particularly for something as complex as a state dinner. So I remember standing at the top of the stairs, and I was beginning to greet the guests as they came in through the East Wing, as they were given their dinner seating, their escort envelopes by the calligraphers. And as I was at the top of the stairs where I was going to usher them in to other military social aides who would always escort the guests for these formal occasions. And I looked up down the staircase, and who was coming up with Gregory Peck? And I really did. I was just starstruck because I remember as a little girl, one of my first movies was seeing To Kill a Mockingbird. So he was a real hero for me. So that was the beginning of my, being around such Hollywood glitter and such incredible actors and actresses like John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. I remember meeting Jimmy Stewart at President Reagan's first 70th birthday party. And he was so serene and so calm, and he was just like, in A Wonderful Life. Claudette Colbert, Loretta Young, all these incredible, screen stars. And they were all the Reagan's friends. Kirk Douglas, they were all the Reagan's friends, and it was really fascinating.
There's a famous story that actually President Reagan got to turn the table on Bob Hope, who he once introduced, I believe, it may have been a dinner for Queen Elizabeth, but in any event, Hope was there, and President Reagan introduced Hope as someone who had performed for 7 American presidents and entertained 4. Pretty good line.
That's a great line.
Did the Bushes have favorite entertainers?
Oh, yeah. I think we always had an eclectic mix. I remember having Lyle Lovett, who I think the Bushes knew and loved. We had Natalie Cole, who was fabulous for one of the governor's dinners. We had, I'm trying to think, some of the others, opera singers. We had the Boys Choir of Harlem, I think, for one of the ladies' lunches. We always tried to, you would try to have sense who the visiting head of state, if it was a state dinner, if they had a preference, whether it was classical or contemporary. And then we tried to book them. And booking the entertainment is always challenging.
Has it gotten harder? Did you ever have an entertainer say, A, we want to be paid, or B, we won't come because of politics?
No, we didn't ask them. No, but most of them usually came from New York, and so I think we sent them shuttle tickets. A driver would pick them up at the airport. We'd put them up at the Hay Adams. They would come to dinner.
And the honor thing, clearly,
right,
was an enormous...
And they had to have a program with their name on it. And they were treated well. That was fine. The wonderful thing, one of the many wonderful things about being at the White House are those White House operators. So you can find people. And one time, this will really date me, but I was trying to reach Bing Crosby, and I reached Mr. Crosby, and I were chatting on it, and I said, Mr. Crosby, where did the White House operators find you? And he said, I'm on a sailboat off Tahiti. So they were wonderful. But we had the entertainment when we were first in the White House was different than the entertainment after the Vietnam War heated up, because we had a lot of dance, and at one point a couple of newspaper people came to me and said, I didn't realize that the president was such a big fan of ballet. Well, the ballet dancers, they're too busy running their own, keeping their bodies in shape. They don't have time to be out protesting and so forth. So we had the American Ballet Theater, we had the Joffrey Ballet, we had the Harkness Ballet. We just became big fans of ballet.
And I read somewhere you really wished you could have done a square dance, but you felt you couldn't
Right.
because of the cultural condescension
Right.
that many in Washington had toward the Johnsons in Texas.
Right, and I couldn't do a barbecue there either. We did do a barbecue at the tail end. It was a staff party because I told the president, I said, you know, all these people that worked for you here, they're not going to really feel they worked for you if they didn't have any Texas barbecue. And so we did have a Texas barbecue then, and it was kind of a tail end of one of the country fairs that we had. And gosh, that was fun. And it came about because the president called me and said, the Congress has been so great this year. They've worked hard, they've stayed late, they've passed my program, and I want you to think of something really fun to do for the Congress. And then as I was leaving the office, he said, you know, people appreciate what you do for their kids more than what you do for them. So think of something that would be fun to do for the kids. So I thought, we can do a country fair. And we had a carnival on the South Lawn with a merry-go-round and a Ferris wheel and fortune teller tents and all kinds of games and hot dogs and baseball players from Baltimore who came and ran a tent that you knocked down bottles and so forth. And when I was working on getting the props for the carnival set up, I called this place in New York where we ordered a lot of props, and I said, I have 2 fortune teller tents, and I need crystal balls, 2 crystal balls. And this guy that I was talking to, he said, where do you want me to send these crystal balls? And I said, send them to the White House. And he says, lady, I'll send them. But you got to tell the president they don't really work. But the country fairs were a great success.
Lori, any crystal balls in the first Bush White House?
No, I'm sorry. We didn't get any crystal balls. We would have liked one, but...
Were there favorite entertainers?
Favorite?
Favorite entertainers?
Well, when you were talking about Bob Hope, it just reminded me that he came a couple times to our state dinners, and you know, he'd walk in and just act like he owned the place. And he'd say, I've been here so many times. You weren't even born when I was here. And, you know, so he was fun. And we had Elizabeth Taylor once, which was very exciting. And she, of course, was very glamorous. And we had Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith one year. And that was quite interesting. She wrote the cutest note to the president and Barbara afterwards saying, my mother never told me what I should wear to the White House. And the reason was that she had come in what she thought was a lovely little outfit. It was a gold, all gold sequins. That part was okay. It was very low and very short.
It was a very little outfit.
A very little outfit. And so she looked adorable in it, of course, because she had a beautiful figure, but she was very cute. And it was cute of her to write and say, you know, I didn't realize I was maybe not quite properly dressed.
Let me ask you, because the White House obviously reflects the broader culture. A lot of people think that broader culture has been coarsened over the last half century. Has that in any way found its way into the White House? I mean, how's the dress code, for example, compared to?
Yes, when we were there, I mean, I even noticed over the 4 years. But people, you know, I think originally came to a black tie dinner in a long gown and even wore long gloves in the very, you know, way back. But they weren't wearing long gloves, but many people they wore beautiful gowns and lots of jewelry and all of that and looked elegant. But, you know, as time went on, you saw things like pants and short dinner dresses and just, you know, a lessening of the formality that had originally been there.
We also know, we won't mention them because to do so would gratify their insatiable desire for publicity. But but we all know of gate crashers. You had a rather distinguished official party crasher in Senator Thurmond.
He was
crashed all of ours.
He didn't crash. He was always invited, but he always had Miss Peach Blossom or Miss Watermelon Queen or something that he'd show up with who wasn't on the guest list. Well, it was not my role to make Senator Thurmond mad. The president had enough problems with President Thurmond without my getting crossways with the Watermelon Princess. So he came in. But I want to say one thing about entertainers, because we had, I don't know, did you all have the Brits that came just twice a year, 3 or 4 times a year? So Prime Minister Wilson was coming, and we didn't have a week's notice. So I thought it's not a big deal, and I'll just call Bob Merrill. He was a baritone for the Metropolitan, and he had done so many things at the White House. So I thought it's going to be easy, and his wife, Marion, was always his accompanist, so it's not going to be complicated, not a big deal. So I called Bob, and I asked him if he'd be available on X time, and he said, well, yes, I think I can. I have a rehearsal, but I think I can juggle that. I'll call you back. Which he did. He said, yes. He said, we'll come down on the shuttle, and you, as usual, send a card to me. Yes, and I'll make reservations for you. Okay, good. And I said, when you get the program organized of what you're going to sing and play and so forth, just call the office and we'll have the program printed out. So all the sweetness and light, the invitations are out, this time by telephone, because there's not enough time to send them out properly. And I got a call from Walt Rostow, who was then the president's national security advisor. And he had just read in the paper, Liz Carpenter put out the press release that Bob was singing and what he was singing and so forth. And he said, you cannot sing for the British Prime Minister who's just announced a pullout of troops east of Suez. You cannot sing on the road to Mandalay. And you cannot sing for the British Prime Minister who's just announced devaluing the British pound. I got plenty of nothing. So I'm making my little speech. This is not politics, this is art. And, well, you know, we came to the party and realized it is politics. So I called Bob and I said, do not answer your phone. But this is a situation. Tell me what else you might sing, and we'll have another set of programs printed out. So, which he did. But I said, when you and Marion come, be sure she brings all the music. So, at the arrival ceremony out on the South Lawn, then the British Prime Minister and the President come into the diplomatic reception room, And the first negotiations was because they've had cartoons in the London papers about how the White House is making fun of the Prime Minister with this show they're putting on for him. So the Prime Minister has been given words that we're changing the program. So he says, you cannot change the program. I cannot survive the change of the program. You've got to do the old program. So that's what we did. And then at the end, Bob Merrill said that he wanted to do an encore. It ain't necessarily so.
That calls to mind the famous incident in 1976, time of the bicentennial, when the Fords were entertaining Queen Elizabeth II, and someone had not checked the music program with Marine Band. So the time came when the president invited Her Majesty to take to the dance floor, and as they did so, the band broke into a lusty rendition of "The Lady is a Tramp." They did check after that. Both of you had the privilege of entertaining Her Majesty. Is there anything unique about preparing for the British royal family?
We had a little incident on the South Lawn, which started off the visit. And at the arrival ceremony, the president makes remarks first and greets the dignitary, in this case, Queen Elizabeth. And they're all standing out there. And then the Queen stepped up to the microphone to make responding remarks. Well, the chief of protocol, who's standing there with them, was meant to pull out the step behind the microphone to raise her to the right height. And she had a lovely purple hat on that day with sort of a brim and stripes around it. But he did not pull out the step. She went ahead and made her remarks. And of course, in the paper the next day, it was the talking hat. And but she had a great sense of humor and addressed the joint session of Congress that morning. And as I wasn't there, but I was told that she opened by saying, "I hope everyone can see me." And then we had one other cute story that no other visiting dignitary ever did while I was there. And that was at the end of her visit, she called over the people. She asked that the chief of protocol bring over to Blair House the top people staff who had planned and orchestrated her stay there. And I was lucky enough to be one of those people. And we went in and had a little private audience, each of us, by ourselves, and she presented us with a gift. And we spoke to her for maybe 3 or 4 minutes and then went in one door and out the next, and it was very special. So she is an extraordinarily lovely woman, I think.
I didn't have the opportunity to host the Queen when I was at the White House, but I went to London with the George and Laura Bush in, I guess it was 2003, when they hosted a return dinner at the American Ambassador's Residence Winfield House, which is a stunning, stunning home. And this was when the Bushes were, the night before, were hosted at Buckingham Palace, a white tie dinner, which I don't think had occurred for an American president in many, many years, almost back to Coolidge or Wilson. So that was a big occasion. And so we, Ambassador and Mrs. Farish were the American ambassador, and they were hosted there, and he had his own chef, and it was an elegant menu, and Mrs. Farish had planned beautiful centerpieces of gorgeous fall apples. This was November, and bright red claws and a lot of gold. And when I was there early in the afternoon working and sorting out the seating, I did immediately was aware of this tiny little dog, their dog, who really had free reign of this beautiful home. And I thought, okay, well, that's all right. The Farishes live here all the time. They entertain all the time. This won't be a problem. So the guests arrived. We had cocktails, and we had the receiving line. And at the end of the line, we ushered in our 4 principals, President and Mrs. Bush and Her Majesty and Prince Philip. And everyone was seated, and they had begun to pour wine for President Bush to make a toast to the Queen, who, of course, was seated on his right. And Prince Philip was seated on Mrs. Bush's right, who at her table, I must throw in, was Michael Caine, the wonderful actor. So that was our star for the evening. And President Bush began his toast, and out of the corner of my eye, I see this tiny little white dog and his little 4 legs going right towards his mistress. And I held my breath, and I thought, no, I know I'd seen them put him in the kitchen earlier. And I hear this little bark, woof. And the president looks around, and he smiles, and Mrs. Farish didn't move. So the president went on. And then 30 seconds later, another louder bark. And that's when I got this look from the president, and I thought, I've got to do something. So that's when I ran over to Mrs. Farish and captured the dog and put him back in the kitchen. That was my moment of royalty.
We'll have to add that to the job description.
Right. Getting the dog.
Just summing up, and gosh, I wish we had more time, but clearly things have changed. Some things haven't changed. People still occasionally try to change place cards to get closer to the president. People go to outlandish lengths to try to get into dinners, including claiming fatal illnesses when none exist. And they smoke less and they drink a lot less, which brings us to Joan Crawford.
I bet the same is true for you all, but every time when I was seating a White House dinner, there would be one table that I would think, gosh, if I were a guest at the dinner tonight, that's where I would like to sit. And this dinner, I thought, gosh, I would like to be at this table with Joan Crawford and Don Hewitt and Joe Califano and Kathy Douglas, who was the brand new young bride of a Supreme Court Justice, Bill Douglas. And did I say Joan Crawford?
Yeah.
Well, Joan Crawford had arrived with her own flask of vodka. I mean, we did pass a lot of drinks, but she didn't think that there were going to be enough. So she had her own flask. Anyway, the dinner was served, and then in Joan Crawford's defense, I would say that we weren't smart enough to know that we had also invited her ex-husband, Douglas, what?
Fairbanks.
French it tone?
No, some other one.
Well,
Anyway,
I think there was more than one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were passing notes back and forth during the dinner. But then the dessert plates came, and Kathy Douglas is now a very grown-up, very sophisticated lady, but she was very new on the scene then. And so Joan Crawford, who was seated across the table from Mrs. Douglas, and Joan Crawford knew that you're supposed to put the fork and the spoon here and take the finger bowl and the doily and put it here so that you can serve your dessert on the clean plate. Well, Kathy didn't know that. Maybe she would have figured it out, but Ms. Crawford wasn't going to wait for that. So she stood up and she said, "This is what you're supposed to do." And so she moved her flower bowl and she moved her silverware and said, "You'll learn how to do that in the future."
Aren't you glad you didn't have the job in the 24/7 news cycle, period? Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking Bess Abel, Lori Firestone, and Kathy Fenton.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
I had
Good to see you. Richard, thank you very much.